The rain wasn't just falling. It was attacking the small house, each drop a tiny fist against the window pane. Inside, the silence was louder than the storm. 8-year-old Luna stood in the center of the room, her big, curious eyes fixed on her mother. But the woman staring back wasn't her mother. It was a stranger wearing her face, a mask of cold resolve Luna had never seen before. Elena's hands were clenched, her knuckles white. She wouldn't look at the drawings Luna had laid out on the table, swirls of leaves and faces in the clouds, but at the empty space above her daughter's head. The air grew thick with unspoken words, heavy and suffocating. Luna could feel a tremor starting in her own small hands, a cold fear that had nothing to do with the storm outside. What did you do when your own mother looked through you as if you were glass? The front door creaked open, letting in a gust of wind that smelled of wet earth and endings. Elena's voice, when it finally came, was a splinter of ice. "You don't belong here," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost stolen by the wind, yet they hit Luna with the force of a physical blow. She didn't shove her daughter. She simply guided her, a firm, unforgiving pressure on her small back, leading her over the threshold and into the roaring dark. The worn wooden door, the one Luna had covered in crayon suns, clicked shut behind her. The sound was so final, so absolute. It was the sound of a universe ending. For a moment, Luna didn't move, certain it was a mistake, a terrible dream. She waited for the click of the lock to be undone, but all she heard was the storm. She pressed her small palms against the rough wood of the door, feeling the vibrations of the thunder through her bones. "Mama!" The name was a fragile puff of air, instantly devoured by the wind. Rain plastered her thin dress to her skin, and a chill began to creep deep into her marrow. It was a coldness that came not just from the storm, but from the sudden, gaping void where her mother's love used to be. The yellow light in the window she had always seen as a beacon of safety now seemed like a distant, alien star. It was the light of a home that was no longer hers. Have you ever felt a loneliness so complete it feels like the world has forgotten your name? Luna stood there, a ghost on her own doorstep, invisible to the only person she had left. Her mind, a vibrant canvas of colors and shapes, just moments before, went blank with shock. All she could feel was a single, piercing question echoing in the emptiness. Why? Was it because she talked to the trees? Was it because the patterns she drew in the dirt were too strange? The very things that made her feel alive were the things that had cast her out. She clutched the single, crumpled drawing still in her pocket, a portrait of her mother smiling, surrounded by a halo of dandelions. The rain began to bleed the colors, the ink of the smile running down the paper like a black tear. How does a memory that once brought you comfort suddenly become the sharpest edge of your pain? The paper grew limp and heavy, a soggy ruin of what was. Slowly, she lowered her hands from the door. There was no point in knocking. The silence from inside was its own answer. She turned, her small bare feet sinking into the mud, and faced the darkness. The forest loomed before her, a wall of shifting shadows and menacing sounds, but the house behind her felt infinitely more terrifying. It was a tomb of a life she no longer had, a tiny, shivering figure against the fury of the night. She took a hesitant step toward the trees, away from the only home she had ever known. She was just a child. She only wanted to be loved, and was that too much to ask? As the door clicked shut, Elena did not feel relief. She felt a profound, bottomless hollowness, as if she had just carved out her own heart and thrown it into the storm. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood, the thunder vibrating through her skull, mirroring the chaos inside. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper Luna's name, a chorus of accusation from the night itself. Her hands trembled, not with anger, but with a terror so deep it felt ancient. It wasn't her daughter she feared. It was the eyes of the neighbors, the sharp, judging glances in the market, the pious whispers behind cupped hands. In this small, suffocating town, acceptance was oxygen, and Elena felt herself starting to choke. The whispers had started as a trickle and become a flood. It began with Luna talking to the dandelions as if they were old friends. Then it was the intricate, swirling patterns she'd draw in the dirt, patterns that made the old women cross themselves. Not natural, they'd murmur over their fences. A strange one. The whispers followed Elena like a shadow, tainting every interaction. The baker would hand her bread with a pitying look, The other mothers would pull their children closer when Luna approached, their smiles tight and false. Elena saw the judgment in their gazes, a reflection of her own growing fear. How do you fight an enemy made of whispers, a poison that seeps into everything you love? Elena was already walking on thin ice. As a young widow, she was an anomaly, a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of the community. Her husband's death had left her not just grieving, but exposed and vulnerable. Her place in this world was conditional, dependent on her ability to be quiet, to conform, to be unremarkable. But Luna was remarkable. She was a vibrant, untamed song in a world that demanded silence. Every strange and beautiful thing about her daughter was another stone cast at their fragile glass house. Elena felt the weight of their survival resting on her shoulders, and it was crushing her. Would you have been stronger in her place, with the world watching your every move? The breaking point came on a sun-drenched afternoon that felt like a mockery. Mrs. Gable, whose word was law among the town's matriarchs, had found Luna in her garden, gently tracing the veins on a leaf and whispering to it. The woman had snatched her own child away as if Luna were diseased, her face a mask of cold disgust. "You need to handle that," she had hissed at Elena later, her voice dripping with threat. "That strangeness, it's an ill omen for us all." In that moment, Elena's love was eclipsed by a primal panic. It was the fear of the outcast, the terror of being utterly alone. The choice was made not in her heart, but in the pit of her stomach. She had to build a reason, a lie strong enough to live with. As she pushed Luna into the rain, a desperate narrative formed in her mind. "I'm setting her free. This town will crush her spirit. They will break everything that makes her unique. Out there in the wild, she can be herself." It was a beautiful, poisonous lie, a masterpiece of self-deception designed to mask an ugly truth. She was sacrificing her child to save herself. She was choosing the cold comfort of acceptance over the fierce, unconditional love a mother should provide. Can an act of self-preservation be forgiven when it costs a child her entire world? Now, the storm outside raged on, but the silence inside the house was the true devastation. The crayon suns on the door seemed to mock her. Luna's drawings, left on the table, felt like ghosts of a life she had just murdered. Elena sank to the floor, the sound of her own ragged breathing filling the void. She had cast out the curse, but in doing so she had cursed herself. She was safe from the neighbors' whispers, but she would be forever haunted by the silence of her daughter. She had closed the door on the storm, only to find she had locked the real monster inside with her. She hadn't just abandoned her child, she had abandoned herself. The forest was not a sanctuary, it was a beast of teeth and shadow. Every snap of a twig was a predator's footstep, every rustle of leaves a whispered threat. The rain had stopped, but the trees wept cold. Heavy drops that soaked through Luna's thin dress, chilling her to the bone. She stumbled over unseen roots. Her small hands scraped raw by bark as she fought her way deeper into the suffocating darkness. The fear was a living thing, coiling in her stomach, a cold serpent that made breathing a conscious, painful effort. She didn't know where she was going, only that she was running from the memory of a closing door. Is there anything more terrifying than realizing the monster you feared was waiting for you at home? Her first night was spent huddled in the hollow of an ancient, fallen log. The damp wood smelled of decay and earth, a scent that would forever be linked to absolute despair. Shivering uncontrollably, she pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Every hoot of an owl, every distant howl, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache that grew sharper with each passing hour. She closed her eyes and saw her bed, the soft quilt her grandmother had made, the faint light from the hall spilling under the door. Now there was only darkness. Would you have been able to sleep through a night like that, with only the cold ground for a bed? When dawn finally broke, it offered no warmth, only a grey, indifferent light that revealed the true scale of her isolation. The forest stretched on endlessly in every direction, a vast, green ocean threatening to swallow her whole. The hunger was no longer an ache, it was a fire in her belly demanding attention. She saw bright red berries clinging to a bush and stuffed a handful into her mouth, only to spit them out, their taste bitter and wrong. She was a creature of colors and dreams, utterly unequipped for this brutal reality. Her world had been her mother's arms, her drawings, the stories in the clouds. Here, survival was a language she did not speak. Her thoughts were a relentless, looping nightmare of her mother's face, the coldness in Elena's eyes, the hard line of her mouth. Luna replayed the moment 1,000 times, searching for the exact second she had broken everything. Was it the drawing of the man with roots for hair? Was it when she told her mother the wind had a name, she believed, with the absolute certainty of a child, that it was her fault? She had been too strange, too much. The crumpled, rain-soaked drawing in her pocket was a constant, soggy reminder of her failure. How do you stop blaming yourself for a crime you didn't even commit? She was judge, jury, and prisoner in the courtroom of her own mind. For days, she wandered, a tiny ghost drifting through the trees. The world became a blur of green and brown, her awareness shrinking to the immediate primal needs: water from a stream, the hope of finding something to eat, a place to hide from the night. She eventually found a dilapidated hunter's shack, its door hanging off a single hinge. The inside was musty and filled with cobwebs, but it had 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak too badly. It became her cage and her shelter. She would sit for hours on the dirt floor, tracing patterns in the dust, the only art she had left. This wasn't a life. It was the act of not dying, one miserable hour at a time. The hunger became a constant companion, a cruel voice that whispered in her ear. It made her dizzy, made her bones feel like they were made of brittle glass. Her stomach cramped so violently she would curl into a ball, tears streaming down her face. She learned to eat things she never would have imagined. Tough roots she dug up with her fingers, insects she caught scurrying on the floor. There was no disgust, only a desperate, animal need to quiet the pain inside her. If you had found that small, starving child huddled in the dirt, her face streaked with grime and tears, what would you have done? Would you have looked away? The silence was the worst part. In the beginning, she would talk to herself, whispering her mother's name, telling stories to the spiders in the corners, but her own voice sounded thin and alien in the oppressive quiet. Soon, she stopped speaking altogether. The silence seeped into her, filling the spaces where laughter and questions used to be. She felt herself becoming part of the forest, mute, watchful, and wild. She forgot the sound of her own name being spoken with affection. A child needs to hear her name called with love. Without it, does she even exist? She was fading, becoming as invisible as her mother had made her feel. Sometimes, driven by a pain sharper than hunger, she would creep to the edge of the woods. From there, she could see the town, a collection of distant, twinkling lights that represented a universe she was banished from. She saw families sitting down for dinner through their windows, saw children chasing each other in the twilight. Once, she saw her own house. A warm, yellow light glowed in the kitchen window. The sight was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her mother was in there, living her life, while she was out here, a forgotten secret. The world had moved on without her, and the loneliness was an abyss with no bottom. She began to believe the town's whispers. She was strange. She was an ill omen. There was something wrong deep inside her, a darkness she had been born with that had forced her own mother to cast her out. She would look at her reflection in a puddle, a gaunt, feral creature with wild hair and haunted eyes, and she wouldn't recognize herself. This thing looking back at her deserved to be alone. It deserved the hunger and the cold. The rejection had become a seed planted in her soul, and now it was growing, its thorny vines wrapping around her heart. How does a child learn to love herself when she's been taught she is unlovable? Her small body began to surrender. A fever took hold, leaving her shivering one moment and burning the next. She lay on the cold floor of the shack, too weak to move, the world swimming in and out of focus. The line between waking and dreaming blurred. She saw her mother's face, not cold this time, but weeping, reaching for her. It was a beautiful, cruel hallucination. This, she thought with a strange sense of peace, was the end. She was ready. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness pull her under. She was just a child who had been thrown away, and now the world was finally finishing the job. But the darkness was not empty. Through the haze of fever, she felt a presence. It wasn't menacing. It was a gentle warmth near her forehead, a soft touch on her arm, a voice, low and cracked with age, murmured something she couldn't understand. It wasn't her mother's voice. It was someone else. She forced her heavy eyelids to open a crack. All she could see was the outline of a figure against the light of the doorway, a pair of old, worn leather boots planted firmly on the dirt floor. A hand, wrinkled and kind, reached for her again. For the first time in an eternity, she wasn't alone. The world returned not as a rush, but as a gentle tide, a warmth on her forehead, a soft, woolen blanket against her skin, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. Luna's eyes fluttered open, not to the damp darkness of the shack, but to the low, fire-lit ceiling of a small cabin. An old woman with a face like a kind, wrinkled map sat beside her, spooning warm broth into a bowl. The woman didn't speak. She simply offered. Luna, whose body had only known the violence of hunger and cold, accepted the offering with a trembling hand. There were no questions, no judgments in the woman's eyes, only a quiet, steady presence. It was a silence entirely different from her mother's. Not an absence, but a sanctuary. The woman's name was Isabel, and her cabin was a world woven from simple things. A single room, a stone hearth, shelves lined with jars of seeds and preserved berries. It was a life of profound poverty, yet it felt richer than anything Luna had ever known. In her mother's house, every object had been clean, ordered, and silent with unspoken rules. Here, everything was worn, loved and alive with purpose. Isabel moved with a slow, calming grace, never forcing Luna to speak, never asking where she came from. She simply made space for the girl's wounded silence. She would leave a piece of bread on the table, point to the water bucket, and go about her work, allowing Luna to exist without the terrifying weight of expectation. Isabel didn't see a strange, broken child. She saw a language she understood. She watched Luna trace the swirling grain of the wooden table with her fingertip, her eyes lost in a world no one else could see. She saw the girl arranging fallen leaves into intricate, sorrowful patterns on the cabin floor. One afternoon, instead of sweeping them away, Isabel placed a smooth piece of charcoal in Luna's hand and laid a flat piece of birch bark before her. It was not a command, but an offering, a silent permission slip. She wasn't trying to fix Luna. She was simply handing her the tools to speak her own silent tongue. Have you ever had someone see the real you, the part you keep hidden, and not turn away? At first, Luna's hands were clumsy, stiff with fear and disuse, but the urge to create was a current stronger than her doubt. The charcoal became an extension of her soul, pouring out the shadows and monsters that lived inside her head. Isabel brought her clay from the river, and Luna's small fingers, once used to digging for roots, now molded her pain into form. She sculpted small twisted figures, creatures with hollow eyes and reaching hands, trees with faces weeping sap. It wasn't beautiful in a conventional way. It was raw, visceral and utterly true. It was the physical manifestation of a scream she had held in for a lifetime. Her art became the vessel for every unspoken word, every unshed tear. With Isabel as her quiet guide, the forest was reborn. The beast of teeth and shadow that had once tormented her became her sanctuary, her studio. The wind that had chilled her to the bone now whispered stories in the leaves. Isabel showed her how to grind rocks into pigment, how to find the softest wood for carving, how to listen to the rhythm of the seasons. The world that had cast her out was now inviting her in, offering up its secrets. Luna began to see that the very things that made her an outcast, her sensitivity, her connection to the wild, her unique vision, were not weaknesses. They were her strength. Sometimes, all a child needs is someone who says, "I believe in you." A new feeling, fragile as a seedling pushing through frozen earth, began to grow inside her. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was hope. The hope that she was not a monster. The hope that her way of seeing wasn't a curse, but a gift. The nightmares of her mother's cold eyes still came, leaving her breathless in the dark. The scar of that closed door would never fully fade. But now, when she awoke, there was the steady crackle of the fire in the hearth. There was the quiet presence of Isabel, a silent promise that she would not be abandoned again. It was a small, flickering light in an immense darkness, but for the first time, Luna believed it might be enough. The world, once a quiet sanctuary of two, suddenly felt crowded. The art teacher, a kind man named Mr. Davies, began visiting regularly, bringing with him the scent of the town and gifts that felt like burdens. He laid out pristine canvases and tubes of brilliant, factory-made paint, colors so loud they screamed. Luna stared at the cadmium yellow, the cerulean blue. They felt like a foreign language. Her colors were the muted browns of river clay, the deep green of moss, the rusty red of iron-rich earth. These new tools didn't feel like a gift. They felt like a test, a demand to be someone she wasn't. The pressure to perform, to prove her talent, was worthy, was a heavy cloak, suffocating the fragile spark of creativity. "You've been discovered," they said, but all she felt was lost. Mr. Davies convinced her to visit the town, to see a small gallery he thought would inspire her. The trip was a descent into a forgotten hell. The noise of a cart rattling on cobblestones was a physical assault. The smell of baking bread, once a comfort, now conjured a ghost of her mother's kitchen, a memory sharp as glass. She saw a group of children laughing, their faces open and bright, and a chasm of loneliness opened in her chest. Then, a woman walking past stopped, her eyes widening in recognition. She grabbed her friend's arm, whispering behind her hand, "It's her, the wild girl." The gesture, the hushed judgment. It was the same look, the same poison that had driven her from her home. "Have you ever realized your scars are invisible to everyone but you?" The whispers followed her back to the woods. A few of the town's bolder children, fueled by cruel curiosity, ventured near the cabin. They found her one afternoon carving a piece of driftwood. "Freak," one of them hissed, his voice a mimicry of his parents'. "Witch," another chanted. They were just words, but they landed like stones. Then one boy picked up an actual stone and hurled it. It flew past her, crashing into a delicate clay sculpture she had made, a loving tribute to Isabel. It shattered on the ground. The sound was deafening, an echo of a door clicking shut, of a world breaking. The cruelty wasn't just an attack on her art. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear. She did not belong anywhere. The incident left a shadow over the cabin, and it fell most heavily on Isabel. The old woman's quiet strength seemed to falter. A persistent cough settled in her chest, and a tremor appeared in the hands that had so gently mended Luna's world. For the first time, Luna saw not an unshakable protector, but a fragile, aging woman. A new and more profound terror began to bloom inside her, the fear of losing the only person who had ever truly seen her. This fear was different from the sharp trauma of her mother's rejection. It was a slow, creeping dread, the terror of watching your only anchor rust away. What do you do when the person who taught you to be strong starts to fade before your eyes? The joy of creation curdled into ash. When Luna looked at her work now, she no longer saw her voice. She saw only the evidence of her strangeness. The twisted roots, the hollow-eyed figures, they were proof of her monstrosity. The children's taunts echoed in her head, merging with her mother's final icy words. She began to believe them. Maybe she was a curse, a darkness that brought only ruin. In a fit of self-loathing, she took a mallet and smashed two of her most intricate wooden sculptures, the ones Mr. Davies had admired most. The splintering wood was a relief, a violent release. She wanted to destroy every piece of herself that was different, to erase the artist and leave only a void. In the depths of her despair, a strange and treacherous memory surfaced. She remembered her mother before the fear took hold, the warmth of her hand, the sound of her humming a lullaby, the way she smelled of lavender and rain, the longing for that mother, the one who existed in fleeting moments of sunshine, was an agony worse than any hunger she had known. This painful nostalgia poisoned her present. Was this life of struggle and creation really better than the ghost of a life she'd lost? The confusion was a storm inside her, tearing her between a past that had rejected her and a future she felt too broken to build. Have you ever felt yourself missing the very person who broke you? She couldn't do it anymore. The pressure, the fear, the grief, it was a weight too heavy to carry. She decided to run, not from the town but from everything. From Isabel's fading health, from Mr. Davies' expectations, from the ghost of her mother. She would go deeper into the forest, where no one could find her, where she could finally become the invisible thing she had always been told she was. She packed a small bundle, a bit of dried meat, a water skin, and stood at the cabin door, ready to step back into the absolute solitude that was both her terror and her only perceived refuge. She had fallen before, but something inside her had always refused to stay on the ground. Would it fail her now? As her hand touched the rough wood of the door, a frail, trembling hand covered her own. It was Isabel. She looked weaker than ever, her breath shallow, but her eyes were clear and fiercely present. She said nothing. Instead, she led Luna to the corner where the shards of the shattered clay sculpture lay. With painstaking effort, Isabel knelt and picked up the two largest pieces. She dipped her finger into a small pot of wet clay, the same clay Luna had used to create the figure, and began to carefully join the broken edges. The new clay filled the cracks, not hiding them, but making them part of the design. It was a silent, powerful lesson. Being broken does not mean you are beyond repair. Watching Isabel's gnarled fingers work, mending what had been violently destroyed, Luna felt a profound shift inside her. Isabel wasn't fixing the sculpture, she was healing it. She was showing her that the cracks could become part of its story, part of its strength. Luna looked down at her own hands, stained with charcoal and dirt. These were not the hands of a monster, they were the hands of a survivor, a creator. A slow, shuddering breath escaped her lips. Releasing a pain she hadn't known she was holding, she knelt beside Isabel, picked up another broken piece and began to help. The choice was made in that silent, sacred moment. She would not run. She would stay. She would face the world, not in spite of her cracks but because of them. 10 years later, the air in the gallery was sterile and silent, a stark white canvas for the raw, earthy art it held, and at its center stood Luna. She was 18. But her eyes held the ancient wisdom of the forest she called home. No longer a shivering ghost, she was a quiet storm, her presence as solid and rooted as the old-growth trees she carved. Dressed in simple, dark fabric, she moved with a grace that was both wild and deliberate, explaining a sculpture to an enraptured audience. The twisted roots and gnarled wood in her hands were not just art, they were her story, her language, her survival made tangible. She had taken the ugliest parts of her life, the fear, the loneliness, and transformed them into a beauty so profound it made people hold their breath. One sculpture, in particular, drew a crowd. It was a life-sized piece, carved from a single fallen oak, depicting a young girl curled inside the hollow of a log. But she wasn't hiding. Her head was tilted, her ear pressed against the wood as if listening to its secrets, her face a mask of serene concentration. The grain of the wood flowed around her like a protective current, and from her outstretched fingers, tiny, intricate leaves seemed to be sprouting, carved from the same wood. It was a portrait of absolute desolation, transformed into a moment of sacred connection. She had named it The Whisper of the Wood. It was her first night of survival, not remembered as a trauma, but reimagined as an initiation, the moment the forest first spoke to her. At the back of the room, a woman slipped through the door, a ghost from a different world. Elena was a spectre of faded grey, her body stooped by the weight of a decade of silent regret. Sickness had hollowed her cheeks and stolen the color from her hair, leaving her frail and almost translucent. She had seen the article in a city paper, a small grainy photo of a wilderness artist, and a name that had stopped her heart. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need, she had come, expecting to find, what? A ghost like herself, a broken girl. Instead, she saw a room full of people looking with reverence at the very soul she had tried to extinguish, the very strangeness she had cast into the storm. Her eyes found Luna, and the air left her lungs in a painful gasp. This was not the small, frightened child she replayed in her nightmares. This was a woman, poised and powerful, her daughter's familiar eyes now holding a universe of strength Eleanor couldn't comprehend. She saw the way Luna's hands, once small and dirty, now commanded the attention of the entire room, gesturing with a quiet authority that was both breathtaking and terrifying. It was a vision that shattered the fragile lies Elena had built to survive her own guilt. The lie that she had set her free crumbled to dust, revealing the ugly truth beneath. She had thrown away a miracle. How does it feel to witness the beautiful world that grew from the seed you tried to bury? Elena's gaze drifted from her daughter to the art. She saw the swirling patterns, the faces in the wood, the chaotic beauty. It was all there. The same visions Luna had tried to show her in crayon drawings, the same language the town had called a curse, now hung on pristine white walls, celebrated as genius. Every sculpture was a page from a story Elena had refused to read. She saw the hunger in a figure carved from bone-white birch, the loneliness in a painting made from mud and ash. This was not just art, it was an accusation. It was the complete, unabridged testimony of the pain she had inflicted. The applause from the crowd felt like a physical blow. They were applauding the survival of a child she had left for dead. Then, across the room, Luna's eyes met hers. For a breathless moment, the gallery, the people, the quiet hum of admiration, it all vanished. There was only the cavernous space of 10 years and the silent, deafening question that hung between them. Luna's expression did not change. There was no flash of anger, no flicker of pain. There was only a calm, steady recognition, the gaze of a mountain looking down at the stone that once broke away from it. The power had shifted so completely it altered the gravity in the room. The shivering, rejected child was gone forever. In her place stood the artist, the creator, the sole authority on her own story, and Elena was just a spectator. Luna felt the old familiar phantom of fear try to rise within her, the instinct of a wounded animal, but it found no purchase. The foundation Isabel had helped her build was too strong, too deep. She looked at this frail, weeping woman and did not see the monster from her nightmares. She saw a sad, broken person, a victim of her own fear. The rage she thought she would feel was absent, replaced by a vast, quiet stillness. She had already screamed her pain into the wood, wept her sorrow into the clay. What was left to say? Her life, her art, this very room. It was the only statement that mattered. She was no longer defined by the moment her mother left her, but by every moment she had chosen to stay. Elena took a hesitant step forward, then another, her body trembling. The crowd parted for her, sensing the immense, invisible weight of the moment. She stopped a few feet from Luna, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerged. The only word she could think of, her daughter's name, felt like a stone in her throat, a name she had forfeited the right to speak. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face, a desperate, silent plea for an absolution she had not earned. She looked at her daughter, this magnificent stranger, and saw everything she had lost, everything she had thrown away in a single act of cowardly self-preservation. Was it too late to be recognized? Luna watched her mother weep, and a single, clear thought rose above the storm of the past. Forgiveness was not a key to unlock a door for Elena. It was a key to unlock the last cage in her own heart. She did not need an apology. She did not need a reunion. Her triumph was not in her mother's return, but in the realization that she no longer needed her. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, Luna acknowledged the ghost before her. Then she turned her back, not with anger, but with peace, and walked toward the next person waiting to ask about her art. She was choosing her present. She was choosing herself. Would you have been able to forgive in that situation? Or is some pain so deep that the only true healing is to walk away? Elena remained a statue of regret at the back of the gallery, a ghost invisible to the living. She watched Luna move through the light, her voice a low, confident murmur as she spoke of her art. There was no anger in her daughter's posture, no hatred in her gaze, only a vast, calm distance, the kind that exists between a star and the person on the ground who can only admire it from afar. The applause that marked the end of the evening was, for Elena, a final judgment. She had not created this beautiful, strong woman. She had merely created the wound from which this strength had grown. The world was celebrating her daughter's survival, and in doing so, was condemning her own failure. Is there any pain greater than seeing the miracle you abandoned flourish without you? She slipped out before the lights came up, a shadow retreating into the night. The city air felt thin and cold, offering no comfort. For 10 years, her guilt had been a private, manageable thing, a story she told herself in the dark. Now it was a living, breathing reality. She had seen the evidence of Luna's suffering hanging on the walls, transformed into something priceless. She had seen the peace in her daughter's eyes, a peace that had been earned in a world without her. Elena was not a character in Luna's story anymore. She was a footnote, the catalyst for a journey she was never invited to join. She would return to her empty house, not haunted by a ghost, but by the vibrant, thriving life of the child she had thrown away. Luna did not return to the forest as a recluse, but as a queen returning to her kingdom. The cabin, now expanded with a large, light-filled studio, was no longer a shelter from the world, but a bridge to it. Isabel, her body more frail but her spirit as fierce as ever, would sit by the fire, her quiet pride a tangible warmth in the room. The forest was no longer a place of fear. It was her collaborator. The wind was her muse, the river clay her medium, the gnarled roots her inspiration. She had stopped creating from a place of pure pain and now worked from a place of profound peace. Her art was no longer a scream, but a song, a hymn to the wild, resilient beauty of things that learn to grow in the dark. She had found a purpose far greater than gallery openings. Every week, a small group of children would make their way up the winding path to her studio. They were the strange ones from the town and beyond, the quiet, the awkward, the ones who saw the world in a different color. Here, in Luna's sanctuary, their strangeness was not a flaw, it was a prerequisite. She didn't teach them how to draw a perfect circle. She taught them how to find the face in a piece of driftwood, how to make paint from crushed berries, how to listen to the story a stone wants to tell. She was giving them the one thing she had desperately needed, permission to be exactly who they were. Have you ever wondered what could grow if we nurtured uniqueness instead of fearing it? One afternoon, she found a young boy weeping over a clay bird he had dropped, its wing shattered. He looked up at her, his eyes full of the same self-loathing she knew so well. "It's broken," he whispered. "It's ruined." Luna simply smiled, retrieving the mended sculpture of the woman Isabel had repaired years ago. She showed him the fine, golden lines where the cracks had been filled. "It's not ruined," she said softly, her voice the sound of gentle rain. "It's just more interesting now. The cracks are how the light gets in." In that moment, she wasn't just fixing a clay bird. She was mending a universe, passing on the sacred lesson that had saved her life. She was teaching them that being broken is not an end, but a beginning. Her life was not a grand spectacle, but a quiet masterpiece. It was the warmth of Isabel's hand in hers, the smell of damp earth after a storm, the focused silence of a child discovering their own voice. The memory of her mother was no longer a gaping wound, but a faded scar, a reminder not of what she had lost, but of everything she had found in its place. She had been cast out, left to the mercy of the storm by the one who was supposed to be her shelter. But in the wilderness, she had built her own home, not of wood and stone, but of purpose, art, and unconditional love. She was rejected by the one who should have loved her, but was embraced by a world that needed her light. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more tales of hope and resilience. Like and share this video to spread the message that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths.